Are you ready to start your podcast but don't know where to start? Today we're talking about the power of podcasting and why you need to start now on this episode of Coffee with Tea. Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Coffee with Tea. I'm your host, Tanya Tyler, and I'm excited because we're going to be talking about the power of podcasting with another fellow podcaster. And before I dive into that, I'd like to welcome Mr. Bernard Gleton to the show. Welcome, sir.
Thank you for having me. So happy to be here. Can't wait to get this thing started.
I know, I love podcasting. I love, all the journeys that has brought me here. So I'm excited to have you on, and let's talk about how you started your podcast and stuff like that, and maybe give some people advice on how maybe they can get started in theirs. But before we really dive into that, I want you to tell a little bit about who you are and what you do, and how you've been dealing with this whole gas and COVID and everything else. So the floor is yours, sir. Go ahead. Tell a little bit about who you are.
All right. So let me start by saying that my background has started in sports. I've been playing sports all my life. Had played a short stint of Canadian Football League in Canada for a little bit, and then came back home. Tore my knee. Had to figure out what I'm going to do after that point. And then once I've done that, I've realized that the IT field would be awesome, mainly because in my football career, I had to be super analytical, and IT field was super analytical. So I could just put those skills to work and keep that moving, right? So I've been in the IT field for about a dozen years now. And about 2-3 years ago, about right before the pandemic, I said, man, I really want to do something else. I feel this creative itch. I really want to do something creative. And I've been listening to podcasts for, maybe 5 years prior to. And I said, you know what? I think that's what I'm going to do. But I had started a IT business, and the whole purpose of me starting a podcast was for me to get more clients and customers into my IT business. And so I started my podcast. It wasn't going to be a technical podcast. It was going to be a business podcast, because my customers, or the customers I wanted to get, was going to be small businesses and medium businesses, and maybe even a few bigger businesses, right? Had some experience dealing with government contracts and things of that nature. So once I started creating the podcast and everything like that, I've realized the whole purpose of the podcast was for me to get them to be customers and talk about, what I could do for them and all that stuff. And I kept forgetting to say something about it. So I just said, well, all right, well, screw this. I'm just going to stick to just doing business podcast, right? Because I was learning so much from the people I was bringing onto the show. And I think in the long run, it helped make me an even better entrepreneur and think about things in a business sense, and how to conduct business, and, just how to succeed, or whatever success looks like, right? But just how to be successful in business by having successful people onto my podcast. And so I dropped my first episode maybe a week before, it was a week after COVID hit, right? And hindsight is 2020. I don't know if that's perfect timing or bad timing, but it all worked out. So here I am, 2 years in the game. Started the Genesis Project podcast, and it's been going on since then.
Right. Well, like I said, I'm always fascinated with your story, and I know we connected through a mutual friends meetup group. And so when you were telling your story, I was like, I have got to get that man on to talk to him. So thank you for accepting my invitation. But I really wanted to ask you, when you were, started your podcast and you had the premises in your mind, like you were to sell, what really, what benefits did you see from making that pivot to making it about them? Is there something that you really could see?
Yeah. So like I said, originally it was supposed to be just a way for me to create a sales pipe, right? And I just kept forgetting to ask people about or just throwing myself in there to see how I could help them technically, right? And that was the first pivot, just realizing I kept forgetting to ask the whole reason why I started this thing, right? The second pivot was realizing just how much information and things of that nature that I was gaining from having people on my show. You know what I mean? I mean, let's face it, it's not like I started this yesterday. I knew exactly what to do and all that type of stuff. I had some type of idea, you know what I mean? And I mentioned earlier that I've been listening to the podcast for 5 years up to that point. So I had an idea of how I was going to do a podcast, how I was going to frame my podcast, how I wanted to sound, how I wanted to come off, who I was going to make this podcast for, and all that type of stuff, right? So once I made the pivot from it being about me getting customers into my sales line, it turned from there to being, well, how do I be a better business person? I just want to learn, and I say this all the time. I've selfishly gotten more people who were successful onto my show just for me to get that information. And I'm unselfishly giving it out to everybody for free.
Right. Oh, that's key. That's key right there. So
Yeah.
that's definitely that's why I love having the stories like you come on and share your story, because I like to encourage people that there's nothing that can hold you back. I mean, all it is basically trial and error, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Listen, this is like being a scientist, right? Like you just throwing a bunch of stuff on the wall and you just hoping that it sticks. And if it sticks, awesome. You just, tweak it a little bit more, you know what I'm saying? And if it doesn't stick, well, you just go back to the drawing board, And I think that's one of the best lessons I've learned from football. You know what I'm saying? If it works, it works. If it doesn't, we'll try something else. You know what I mean? And it really got it got a lot of that fear out of my system. You know what I mean? So yeah, either go hard or go home.
I'm glad you brought up the fear, because that was like the next question I have. What would your advice be to somebody who's afraid to even get started?
All right, so I had this guy on my show, and he phrased it this way as what was it called? It was pretty much just negative self-talk, right? The if, the wants, all that type of stuff, right? Why do anybody want to listen to me, or why should people listen to me? Do I have anything valuable to offer, and all that type of stuff, right? One of the things that, again, something else I learned from football is you square up that problem and you go head on. It doesn't matter if you win that fight or if you lose that fight or if it's a stalemate. You still went, balls to the wall and just went full force into it, right? So what I tell people when it comes to fear, do it. Don't do it. Don't think about it. Just do it. Just do it. Like Nike, just do it. Because the sooner you sit, or the more you sit and you consider this idea, the more you're allowing fear to creep in, right? So as soon as you get that idea, just do it. Don't even think about it. Just do it. You need to be instinctive and react instead of just sitting back and just waiting for it to come to you, because it's never going to come to you. You have to go chase after it. And the way I like to end my show is by saying, in everything that you do and everything that you chase after it with violent action. Meaning that if you chase after whatever you want to do, be it podcasting, you chase it with violent action. I mean, you get after it with so much tenacity, with that action, that fear has no choice but to run away. Is it still going to be there? Yeah, of course it's still going to be there. But because you did so much action behind that thing, it's going to be small and minuscule to the bigger picture that you have in your mind.
Right. Golden gems, dropping it by the chancellor. Thank you. This is where I like to remind everybody that if you're picking up the gems that Bernard has been dropping, please give us a thumbs up, follow up, maybe down with a comment below. And we're going to dive into more about how he actually came up with a theme for his podcast. Because, some people have an idea, like, I don't know where I want to go with this. But yours is called, please remind us, what's the name of your podcast, sir?
Yes. So my podcast is called the Genesis Project Podcast. Business principles for beginners from the School of Hard Knocks, right? And I know the name could sometimes be off-putting. So let me explain that. So my show obviously is not religious. However, we all have this basic understanding that Genesis is the first book of the Bible, right? It's the beginnings. That's what Genesis is. So in my mind, when it comes to the Genesis moment, what I like to call it the Genesis moment is when you come to a fork in your road of your life. You can go right, you can go left. Does that have to be good? Does that have to be bad? But you can see what your life could be like beyond those first steps, right? So me getting married, that's the Genesis moment. Me trying out for the CFL, that's another Genesis moment. Me starting this podcast, that is another Genesis moment, right? And the reason why I made it, I put project in the name is because I think we are definitely afraid of big things, right? Like Goliath in the Bible, right? Goliath was this huge thing. So we have these humongous goals, but again, a lot of times it scares us, right? Because it's so big. And that's the reason why we don't move towards those goals because it's so big. We made it so big and it scares the crap out of us, right? So if we look at it as if it was just a project, right, it's a lot easier for us to digest it. So, for example, if I wanted to paint this office, I know it would be a weekend project, right? That's something tangible. That's something that I can actually do. It's not as humongous as I once thought it was because this is just a weekend project, right? If it takes a little longer than a weekend, so be it, right? So that's why I named it the Genesis Project Podcast. It's because it's the first step. And just looking at it in a different way, in a different light, breaking it down to the smallest parts in order for me to make it happen, for me to succeed and all that type of stuff.
I like what you're saying. It's like if you're saying if I'm hearing you correctly, and like I said, correct me if I'm wrong, it's like taking these giant steps, like even starting a podcast. What would like your first recommendation step to get somebody to break it down to a smaller project? What would you give their advice for somebody who's like, okay, I hear you, Bernard, but I'm
Right.
afraid. What would you tell me to how to get started?
Okay. The first thing I would tell you is to first, you need to think about your audience. Who are you going to reach out to? Are you going to reach out to somebody specific? Are you going to reach out to somebody like yourself? That's the first thing you need to do. That is called in the business world, that's called a customer avatar. But in the podcasting world, that's what we call the podcast avatar. You know what I'm saying? And you need to know that person so well that you only speak to them, right? Only speak to them. And I used this in a master class once that if I wanted, because I'm in Detroit, Michigan, it's just the Motor City, right? We all about cars around here, right? So if I wanted to come out with a minivan, I have no business going to a drag race show, right? Because that's not my market, right? Where can I find my market for a minivan? I'm gonna go to the PTA meetings. I'm gonna go to football games, soccer games, basketball games, right? And I'm gonna sell my minivan to them, right? When it comes to podcasting, you have to know who is your audience. If you are going to be that minivan, you need to sell your minivan to everybody who are in the PTA, the football games, the soccer moms, and all that type of stuff. Don't try to sell it to these people that's trying to get fast cars and things of that nature. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it makes sense, and it does make sense. And what's one thing? Before I get, because I have two more questions before we really wrap it up. But like, what's the one? What's the biggest, I guess, lesson you've learned since you started this journey?
Mm, the biggest lesson I learned. There's so many things I could say. Um, okay, so let me say this. Success is so subjective, right? It's always changing. It's always changing. For me, success was, you know, um, having a wife, having a nice home, having, two cars and being able to do what we want to do. And then once I hit that, now it's like, all right, well, what else? Now I got to come up with something else that looks like success to me, right? So it's going to be forever changing. So now success for me now looks like me owning my time and still being able to get paid, whether it's passive income or just doing things that I really like to do. For instance, podcasting. and being on other people's podcasts like yours. You know what I'm saying? So just things like that. That's what makes, in my eyes, that's what success looks like to me. So the biggest thing that I've learned just on this journey so far is that success is so subjective. It's going to be forever changing, and it's going to continue to change. So just be, how Bruce Lee say, just go with the flow, right? Be like water. Yes, that's what you got to be.
I love it. And I got, like I said, two more questions, and then we're going to wrap it out, because it's amazing how fast 20 minutes can really fly by, right?
Yeah,
Especially when we're
yeah.
talking about a subject we really enjoy talking about. So, Mr. Bernard, I always like to ask people, like, what's the one thing, if they don't hear anything else that you're sharing with us today, what's the one thing that you want them to take away from this interview today?
All right. In terms of podcasting, the world, since COVID, the world has listened to more podcasts than ever before. So if you're considering about doing podcasting or creating your podcast, just do it. Just do it. Listen, it doesn't matter if you don't like the way you sound. It's not you that's going to be listening. It's going to be other people. Nobody really cares how you sound. All they care about is what's coming out your mouth. Is it going to be jewels? Is it going to be game? Is it going to be valuable? That's all that matters when it comes to podcasting. Listen, I'll be the first to tell you, when I heard myself record on after I recorded myself, when I heard myself, I said, I don't know about this, right? But I kept pushing, and hearing people talk about my podcast to me, saying how it's helped them and how my podcast has changed their minds. I've realized, like, okay, it's not about how I sound, it's about what I'm saying and who I'm bringing in to my show to bring some valuable content, the things that people could learn from my podcast. So, yeah, there you go, right there.
That's some good stuff. That's some good stuff. And I want to also connect and make sure that for those who are interested in connecting with you, where can people find more information about you, your services, and what you do?
Okay, so you can find me just about everywhere. Okay, the name of my podcast is the Genesis Project Podcast. You can find it in just about everywhere where you listen to podcasts: Spotify, Google Podcasts.
Well, thank you. And here's my for everybody who tunes in, I probably should put this on there. My unofficial question is: would you like to come back and maybe dive more into this subject, this conversation?
I told you I was going to keep it PG-13. So I'm not going to say what I want to say, but for the most part, yes, yes. And your viewers can catch me on Instagram. My Instagram handle is the Genesis Project Podcast, or I believe it's Genesis Project Podcast.
Well, thank you, Mr. Bernard. Thank you for sharing your insight and your wisdom and insight.
I
Thank you
love
for
it.
your
I love
time.
doing this.
I do, and I love all the juicy gems. So thank you again for accepting my invitation to come on and share. And I also want to remind everybody who tuned in that feedback is always welcome. Remember, all the
Always.
links that Bernard had mentioned will be posted down in the description box. So please make sure you check out them juicy gems down below. If you have enjoyed today's episode, please give us a like, smash that like button, letting us know. Follow up with a comment if you've enjoyed it. And also, if you want to continue getting continued insight of everything that we got going on, please hit that subscribe button over there. And remember, today, to take things in stride, go with the flow, and create your own path. And we will see you back here on another episode of Coffee with Tea. All right. Bye
Support this
bye.
show. Support this show.